for. We have made some very substantial changes to the plan based on what we heard from the community in June and July and August. And we want to update you on that because I'm not sure that everybody understands the changes that we have made. So with that, I just want to again thank you very much for joining us, and we really look forward to working with you. The next slide here goes through our agenda for tonight's meeting, and just a few things that we're going to try to get through. I'll get through some introductions. We'll go through the meeting logistics. We'll talk about actually what is a variance, what are we asking for here, and what are we not asking for. We'll go through a site presentation so you can see what we're actually proposing, what we want to build at this. Talk a little bit about the timeline and that response to the community, response to all of you and comments that you may have made, and then we'll do this open Q&A period where, again, I think we can just openly just have you raise your hand and we'll call on you, promote you to ask that question. So next slide, please. Just some brief introductions. As I said, I'm Marcus Pochner. I'm part of the team here. Jim Pfeiffer is our architect, and he's joined by Adam. He's going to go through a lot of our presentation material tonight. Also, as another panelist or part of question and answer team, Adam Fenton is here, Daniel Hummel, and Phil Workman. So we have a number of folks here. We wanted to be sure we had our whole team available to answer any questions that you may have. Next slide, please. Just we all live on Zoom these days, and so I think we all understand this, but we did disable the chat function because it's a lot easier to track the questions on the Q&A. So if you'll use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and just do that, and then I'll remind you when we get to the Q&A, we'll probably have people raise their hand as well. Go ahead, Jasper. This is our site that we're here to talk about tonight. We've outlined it there in yellow. I think we have a number of neighbors that are joining us from north of 34th. As you know, the front of this street is Larimer, and then across the alley back to Lawrence, but 34th there. And just to show kind of this site, we wanted to put an outline there and talk a little bit about what we want to build. Next site. Before I go to that, I think it's really important that we share with all of you. We received some letters of opposition. We heard from some neighbors about some ideas of what we were proposing. So we actually want to be very careful here and very clear what this proposal is not. This is not a rezoning. We are not rezoning the site. We want to live entirely within the rezoning restrictions, the zone district that's already in place. Importantly, this is also not a change to the height allowed. We had a previous iteration that did ask for additional height, but because of your community, the community feedback on that, we have changed that. So we are within the same zoning envelope that is allowed today. And lastly, as I said, and I want to say it again, this is not a change to the underlying zoning. We are staying and working entirely within the existing underlying zoning. Next slide, please. Now, what are we doing then? Why are we having this meeting? We are making a couple of variance requests, and a variance is something that you go through the Board of Adjustment process through to make a variance request. So we are actually asking for two separate variances in this process. The first is to request to allow a 14-foot, 6-inch street level height along Larimer Street. Today, and I'm sure many of you worked on that, there was a request that the first floor is always 16 feet. So we are asking for that to be 1.5 feet shorter, and we'll talk about the reasons for that a little later. But that's the first request. The second request is to allow for 4 stories in the IMX3, our zone district, the same zone district that's here today, the IMX3 zone district. We are allowing to go to 4 stories. But we are not increasing the height variance. So we'll talk about that in a lot more detail. But the reason we're doing that is actually some of the site conditions there and how we're designing this building. But we'll talk about it. We are not asking for additional height. We will still stay at the 45-foot cap that is allowed in this zone district. Next slide, please. Before we get too technical or too much in the details, I thought it was really important that we provide what we're not asking for, what we are, and then really have Jim Pfeiffer kind of walk us through this proposal, this site, and all the details in a little more detail. So Jim, if you don't mind doing that with the backdrop of what we've created, if you could walk us through the site details, please.
Certainly. You want to go to the next slide? Thank you. So there's going to be 2 sections that we're showing here, and this is demonstrating 2 different portions of the building, the east-west section through the building. One of them, as we see here, is through the majority of the building. And this is where we don't interact with the alley on an entrance level. You can see on the right side of the screen that the alley is significantly higher than the Larimer Street side. And that is, I'm sure everyone's aware that that is one of the reasons that we're requesting this variance, because of that difference. So for this portion of the building, we don't have to interact with that. I want to make sure that actually, you want to go to the next slide? Let's show how we do interact with this. So this slide shows, if you focus on the right side of the image, that's where our loading dock is. We do have a loading dock that's going to have to load from the alley side. So there's a portion of this building that will have to interact with that piece. So what's interesting about the height of the building is that, or the height of the alley rather, is that we do have to do a little bit of gymnastics as far as structure goes in order to be able to hit that alley at a portion of the building and allow the rest of the building to be usable on the first floor, where we're not trying to enter onto that, into that loading dock from the alley. What I want to make sure we're clear about with some of these slides is how the maximum height is measured. And part of the reason that current max height you see there is 49'2" is because of the site conditions that we've been talking about. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see a dimension from what's called the building specific base plane. And the building specific base plane is a measurement of, if it's an average of the elevation of all four corners of the building, of the site rather. This has been, this has gone through review already, and Leah Dawson has told us what this measurement needs to be based on the site conditions. So we're taking that directly from the zoning department. From there, we're able to go up 45 feet. And so that's where you see that red dashed line at 49'2". So as Marcus has said, the building is still within that 49'2" or 45-foot maximum building height from the base plane. So we are squeezing the 4 stories into that dimension, based on the site conditions we've got here. And if anybody does want to see a little bit more information about how to calculate that, you can refer to the Denver Zoning Code 13.1.3.
If I could just interrupt there and just interject a little bit here. I think one thing I'd add on that, Jim, just to make this a little more clear, is this calculation, this page that you just went through, I want to be really clear for everybody. This is not a variance. This is actually what's allowed per the zoning code. Okay, so this is the height that's allowed per the code with this site condition. So I want to be very clear. We just wanted to be completely transparent about actually what we're showing here, but this is not a variance request. We are staying within the exact height that's allowed per the zone district. I may just add, Jim, before I give it back to you, just as a clarification, we had a couple people join us. We're going through a brief site presentation about this. We will have a full Q&A period at the bottom of this. But if anybody has Q&A, just use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and go ahead and write it now. And we'll start working on organizing this to answer your questions. But feel free to ask questions or I'll call people on the end. So Jim, you can take it back.
Okay, sure. I think that's about all we need to explain about that. So perfect. Go ahead into the first rendering there. So what this rendering shows is the allowable height for both the maximum height of the building and that 16-foot first floor that we've been talking about. So the 16-foot first floor is part of the design overlay district, design overlay number 7 in the Denver Zoning Code. And it's specific to this neighborhood. And it's an effort to try to create a more pedestrian-friendly, human-scale streetscape, as I think some of you guys have looked into, and we have seen some comments about that. We fully appreciate the idea of that, and we want to make sure that this building contributes to that and is not a detriment to that effort. And in doing so, what we feel that first floor mass is doing is carrying that datum across this building, and it's creating a void where we would enter this building. So it's creating essentially a point of interest across the street that that we feel adds to Larimer as a whole. So, but that's what the diagrams on the left and right of this are portraying: the 16-foot and the 45-foot. And most of these are going to kind of reference those same ideas. One of the other points here is that you'll see that there's 3 stories on the front side, and you can kind of see on the back there that it's ghosted. You kind of see the back area. What one of the things that we reacted to based on the direct neighbor input was to move the mass of this building over to the Larimer Street side. There were some comments in the letters that were upset about the transition. Basically, the IMX3 as a zone district is meant to transition from a more commercial, more dense area of the city from that older, less dense, lower residential neighborhood. And in moving this mass towards Larimer Street, we're trying to help with that transition. So we're actually keeping this building lower than it is allowed to be on the alley side in order to preserve some of that mass from the alley side and contribute to the datum across the top of what will be Larimer when it's fully developed. Keep going. And then the front on view, if you want to step in at any point, you can.
Yeah, I think just one quick thing to add is the diagrams to the left and right are really showing what the proposed envelope could be in the future, so that, you know, as Rhino begins further development, it's likely that those two lots would continue this datum. And what we're trying to show here is that we're not actually, you know, building above what that datum is going to be in the future, and that likely that continuity of exterior wall will continue.
Right.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd add on this, I just recognize the number of the names that are attendees here tonight. And I know a lot of you have worked a great deal on this zone district and the neighborhood plan. So I think one thing we just want to show is this is the zoning envelope, if you will. It really shows the streetscape along Larimer. And it also shows, as we just said, kind of the future development of this. So we are staying, and we want to be sure and reiterate that a number of times, within that envelope. We want to respect that neighborhood plan, really reflect it, and really bring the activation to Larimer and make that appropriate transition in the back of the site to the alley and the residential units.
Okay. Next slide.
So this is the alley side. This is showing a little bit more about what I was talking about earlier. You can kind of see the loading dock there. This is a little bit less refined as far as the rendering goes, but it does show that the height is lower than would be allowed. So the effort is here to kind of preserve that mass that's next to this alley. One thing also to note is that you see that red dashed line. Part of the development requirements here is that we dedicate 2 feet of this alley to the city. So part of the effort here will be to expand that alley a little bit to 14 foot as opposed to the 12 foot that it currently is. So hopefully that makes it a little bit easier to get in and out of there at that location. The overall effort from the city is to expand all of these alleys. So as Larimer develops, this will be reflected up and down the alley.
And in addition to that, you can see that the face of the building along the alley is also pulled back an additional 7 or 8 feet to open up, and again to not build to that envelope and allow and not be looming over the adjacent residential district.
Right. Okay. Just another view from the other side shows a little bit more clearly what Adam was just talking about with that step back from the allowed property line. Okay.
I think, and we're going to keep these two gents here for people to come back and ask specific questions, but I just want to cover a little bit of the timeline here. We're doing great on time. We're about 5:15. I'm probably going to spend another 5 or so minutes before we transition to Q&A. So we'll have time to go through everybody's questions, but just a little background on the timeline and how we hope we're responding to the community. So the next slide here kind of lays out the process that we've gone through on this site. There's way too much text on here, but I'll just kind of tell you it briefly. We went to the BOA on June 1st, 6/1/2020 of this year to talk about our first requests. And we had a very thorough discussion there and with community members. And there was this kind of feedback that we've received from all of you about some of these issues. So we actually requested at the end of that a continuance to allow for additional neighborhood feedback. We met specifically with the 2 neighbors on 616 that were at that that hearing or attended that hearing virtually, and we met with them to really try to understand their issues in more detail. We actually spent the next, it says 2 weeks here, but we spent about the next month or two refining our site plan to actually meet the very things that the neighbors were requesting. The first was really relocating that fourth floor from the alley side to Larimer Street, that activation that we talked about, where the appropriate massing should happen and there be that transition to the residential area. Most importantly, the second one is we're no longer asking for a heights variance. We wanted to live within the zoning envelope. We didn't think that was appropriate. Actually, the neighbors made that very clear, and we agree. So we're living within that 45-foot height allowance. Third and fourth year, we just made changes to reflect it. I think another one was very significant is we actually made some changes on the alley, the railings, and a number of things that really helped those residences. They wanted to not have as many eyes, if you will, in their back street or in their backyard. So we changed also some of the railings and some of the design of the building here. So we went through that process in late June and July. Next slide, please. We then had additional kind of updated submittal back to the BOA. We were scheduled on September 1st earlier this month for our second hearing. And over that weekend, there were a number of letters that were turned in from the community. And so we went to that hearing and requested, without presenting any information, and said, we'd like to do some additional neighborhood meetings like the one we're hosting here tonight to be sure that people understand that we have made, we believe, the changes that you are asking for. So a lot of what we're doing tonight is actually to be sure that we heard your concerns, heard your questions, and actually have shown those in our plans. We are not asking for additional height. We are living in the zoning, those kind of things. So that's where we are. We are asking and reschedule back at BOA, but we first wanted to have this dialogue to be sure that we're covering all the material. Next slide, Jasper. I think one thing I just want to do a little background, the letters that were turned in, we looked at those letters, even those letters for the September 1st hearing. A lot of those were dated June, July, and August. So we're pretty certain that a lot of folks don't actually know that we've made these changes. I'll take full blame for that. I want to apologize to neighbors. We are listening, we are hearing your changes, and we are implementing those into our site plan. Next slide. This shows, and I'm sure this is a lot of you, where those letters came from. The neighbors immediately across the alley from us, which we have worked with very closely to revise this, and then our neighbors across 34th, which I know many of you are. We heard your concerns. I think specifically it was, we don't want there to be a rezoning. We don't want there to be additional heights. And so I just wanted to show this is where the letters of opposition, if you will, came from. We're in these two areas here, and we're trying to respond directly to your criticisms, to your thoughts, to your constructive criticism about how to make our site plan better. Next slide, please. This is probably, this is a little bit of the advance of the Q&A here. I just want to specifically say these two things again. In the letter that was submitted by a number of folks was anything built here would be at least restricted by the IMX3 zoning standards. We could not agree more. This is restricted by the IMX3 zoning standards. We are living within those limits, and we have made that come to fruition in our site plan. The second one is that this zoning variance would negatively affect the aim of the current zoning goals to ensure a smooth, gradual transition to building heights and sizes. I hope you've seen in what we're proposing tonight that that's actually been the motivation behind our changes. We flipped the mass, if you will, the 4-story to the Larimer side, so that there was this gradual transition to the neighbors, the single-family neighborhoods behind us. And we've really worked on making that a more appropriate building edge for those single families. So I think we've honored what the community actually wants to do here in that we're activating Larimer and really protecting that transition zone. So I hope, just as a response to the community, that you see that we're trying to incorporate your changes. I think with that, Jasper, our next slide is really just the Q&A slide. And I see a question up, but I know we've got a more than manageable group here. So you can write me a written Q&A there, and I'll look at that. Or in the middle there, you can simply raise your hand, and I'll go through that, and we'll be able to promote you, and you can come on the screen and ask us a question, because we really want to be sure we're understanding the issues here and able to work together. So I think with that, unless Jim or anybody, if there's anything to add, I think we might do this and then transition to the Q&A if we're ready to go. Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to go to question and answer. I would like folks, again, if you do have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll get you there. The first question that I have here is, would we please make these slides and information available? The call-in numbers for regular phones are not working. So I apologize if that's true. I think Zoom is more than challenged sometimes with those call-in numbers. We will absolutely make these available. We'll walk through that. I can share that. And I'm sorry if the person that's asking for these, if you would email us, I will be happy to share them. And then I know that people that registered, also we have your email, so we'll share these back to you as well. The second question here is the image being displayed the latest image? It looks like fewer stories. If you can go, Jim, would you tell us the image that you would like to show that are actually the final image? And I'm going to, yeah, go ahead.
There was only one image there that doesn't show the 3 upper floors. And we put that on there just to try to give a closer look at what the street view would look like. I do know that, I think it was even today or maybe yesterday that we got some feedback that 16 feet is something, as far as a datum and a design driven goal for this street, that's something we want to be focusing on. So we wanted to add that rendering in. And I think it was the very first one that you showed.
Yeah, Jasper, would you mind going back to that first slide, please?
Yeah, so that does show the incorrect number of upper floors, but all of the other images in this slide deck are accurate.
Keep going.
Yeah, keep going to the very first one.
That shows it, but go ahead and go back to the first slide.
There you go. Yeah, so that's an older image. The first floor, the aesthetic of the first floor is going to be exactly this. We would really just have the third brick floor above that.
That's right. So I want to be clear. We're certainly not trying to mislead anybody. This only shows the 2 additional stories. As we said, we flipped the mass. The 3rd story is here on Larimer side, but we are very focused on this datum line. So where you see kind of the plants, the vegetation on the top of this here, we want to reflect that 16 feet. We know that the neighborhood worked really hard to have that 16-foot kind of street presence along Larimer, and we want to honor that, but it still allows us to achieve the building design. I think my next question here, and I just want to go through this again. We had a couple of images, but I want to be sure that we go through it. The question reads, the proposed building height is actually 49 foot plus due to average measurement of alley versus street level. Please be upfront about how this came about. And can you please address the true height from the level of the sidewalk? So there's a couple of different things there, right, Jim? So if you could maybe go back, Jasper, will you go to the blow up of the side profile, the front profile? And then if you don't mind kind of going through that in a little more detail, again, Jim, just to clarify what this is.
Yeah, so we knew this was going to be a point of confusion because it's a confusing piece of the Denver zoning code. I want to first refer you, if you want more information about this, go to 13.1.3. It's available online on Denver zoning. But to explain it here, it's essentially the average of all 4 corners of the site, and that gets us to that 5205.5, that building specific. What did I say?
5202.5.
5202.5, that building specific base plane. And then when you go 45 feet from that, you end up at 49'2" relative to our level 1. So in an architectural section, your level 1 is either going to be at 100 or 0. We've got it labeled here at 0 feet. And so when we measure up the actual facade of the building, you're accurate that the top of the building is going to be closer to that 49'2". But within the zoning code, this site is allowed to do that because of the topographical conditions.
Jasper, can you go back one slide quickly? Yeah. So just to reiterate that, I think this helps show, like the 45 feet is taken from that base plane. I think it's called out there. But the base plane itself is an average between that front and all 4 corners, but it's showing that the height differential of that 9 4'6" between the alley and Larimer Street.
Yeah, that interior lot line in red is essentially, you know, you take the midpoint of that, and that's where you're going to get your base plane.
And this is consistent throughout all the sites on the block and in Denver zoning code. So this is how all measurements are constructed.
Yeah, we have to be so clear about this. I don't want anybody to think that we're trying to do something. This is how it has nothing to do with us. This is how the zoning code works for any site in Denver. And they look at what's called the base plane. So it's just that we have this, you know, the topography that you all know as neighbors around this site that sets that. So I think the thing I want to state over and over again is we have submitted for concept plan, right? We have been working with the city, with development services. We have a site plan that's in front of them, and we will adhere to all city requirements for site planning. And so just so everybody understands it, we are adhering to all those city requirements. We are not asking for additional height whatsoever on this site. And you'll see that when we go back to the Board of Adjustments, we are not asking for a height variance. So I understand that confusion about that and people saying, well, what is actually the height at Larimer Street? But this is actually how the building and the zoning code works itself. Somebody just said it was nice to see me and they got to jump to another meeting. So that's very nice. And I think that question is answered. I think the other one again was just, it came back to the same thing. So I'm going to say that one of the gentlemen here who asked the question about that 45-foot high and the 50 or the 49.2 that we just talked about, they actually asked for the citation in the zoning code about where that is. So I know, Jim, you've given that a couple of times, but if you don't mind, if you go to the question and answer and you can answer that live, and if you would put that section in there, then everybody can have that. When we answer a question or type the answer, then everybody can see that. So if you can type in an answer there, you're able to share that with all of our attendees.
Bear with me, I'm trying to get there. I don't see a place I can type.
Okay.
Never mind, I found it.
Got it. So our next question while you're working on that, just had one come in. So it said, is the roof line, so we're still focused on this, which we should be, is the roof line 45 feet? And what is that extra railing of 4'2" projected to be? So talk about that, actually how the building works. Jim, if you'd walk through that, what is that additional 4 foot above the 45?
I'm sorry, hold on just a second. Okay.
Okay.
All right, that answer is in there. And what was the other question here?
Is the roof line 45 feet? So is the roof line that? And what is the extra railing of 4'2" projected to be?
So we're not going to have any railings per se. We do have parapet. So from both sides of the building, from the alley side and from the Larimer side, you're essentially just going to see more brick up there. If I'm answering that question.
And that's a product of hiding equipment up there. That's a product of how the roofing membrane and drainage happens.
Right.
Yeah, and it's a fall safety for workers up there. Rather than having to provide a railing, we're continuing the facade up. So that 45 feet, again, to reiterate, I think is from the base plane up to that 48.10 max. And that's the height of that. The height of that parapet is at 48'10". Does that answer the question?
It does. And I wonder if we could maybe show kind of a front elevation so you can show when you see the top of building, if you can talk a little bit about, is that at 45 feet or is that 49 feet? So Jasper, would you mind going to an earlier slide that shows the front of the building? There you go. That's fine. So Jim, would you gents answer the question here? Is that at 45 feet and that's the brick you're showing? That's kind of the question they're getting at. What is visible from Larimer?
Sure. So from Larimer, that will be 49'2". And if you'd measure that from the street at 0, that's where you get the 49'2". If you measure it from our base plane, that's where you get the 45. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. That's great. That's great. Okay. So next question here, and if anybody doesn't think we're giving you a full enough answer, just write back or raise your hand, and I'll call on you to ask your question live. So this is a new question that just came in.
Guys, there was a second part to that question in regards to 55 feet that you were showing on that slide.
Okay.
Also, why the 55 feet on the blown up page shown as a max height? Does this come into the design?
Great. Thank you very much. Can you go back to that cross section earlier, Jasper? The second part of this question was, why are we showing, you're getting there, it's all right, sorry folks. Why are you showing this max height? If you can actually go up one more slide. There you go. So that max height of 55 feet that you're seeing kind of on the left-hand side there of this is actually what we're showing is what's across the street. So what's across the street in the RMU 30 zone district, that's there. The max height of that zone district is 55 feet. So we're actually just kind of showing the context. So that has nothing to do with our site plan. That's showing the zone district across the street. But thank you, very good question. So next question here, which was asked, was how can you simultaneously use the slope to give you an additional 4 feet and then claim the slope is the hardship and the reason you want a BOA variance? So I appreciate that. That's a fair question, but I have to break it down into two things. How can you simultaneously use the slope to give you an additional 4 feet? We are not using the slope to give us 4 feet. That is the zoning code and the way every building along any site in Denver and how the zoning code and the zoning planning staff works to determine the height. That's called a base plane. That's how it works on every parcel. So we're not using that at all to give us additional height. The truth of that is the reverse of what you're asking. The very reason that we're getting some additional height there is because it has such interesting, unique, and kind of crazy slope on this site. So the very hardship that we are citing, when you go to the Board of Adjustment, you have to have a reason for asking for the Board of Adjustment for the variance. So you have to cite a hardship. So our hardship that we are citing is the physical conditions that are on this site. As you saw, the alley is 9 or 10 feet above the front of the property. And so we're talking about how we use the building to make that hardship request. So I would actually say it's completely consistent with that hardship is why we're asking for this BOA variance. It's the way the building works and won't work. And so I think one of the things that we've heard and one of the things that was so important to neighbors was, okay, we get it, but if there's going to be height, put it on Larimer, which is exactly what we've done. Don't ask for more height. We are not asking for any more height. This is what's allowed per code. And then secondly, make changes to the back of the building so it transitions to my house across the alley. And we have made those changes specifically from neighbors that have asked because we think those were really appropriate asks that they made. So Jim, anybody, if there's something more to add to that, but anything else on that?
Well, yeah, I do. I think I understand what you're asking here, and I appreciate what you're looking at and how you're looking at this. I do think that that base plane and what it's doing on this site is representative of how strange this site is and how much of a hurdle it is to get from the front to the back. And you know, as we kind of try to state at the beginning here about how we get into it on the from the loading dock side and from the rest of the building, it presents a difference in elevation in such a way that it's kind of creating the need for gymnastics structurally around the building. So I understand what you're saying. The 4 foot makes it seem like that 49'2" as a maximum height seems like we're already getting away with something, but that's essentially telling us that we can stay within this envelope. This site is so strange that we can stay within this height envelope and get these 4 floors. And that will help us, you know, balance out what the issues are with that loading dock.
Sorry, great. Thanks, Jim. That's a really good clarification. It's a completely fair question, as I said, and Jim said. I think this tries to show how we're trying to work with that and the neighborhood. The next question that I have here, and I'll let anybody answer this, maybe one of the owners or architect, but are there plans for a rooftop lounge or bar, etc., activities on the rooftop on the roof?
This is Dan. No, there are not any plans for a rooftop bar or lounge or anything of that matter. We wanted to be very sensitive with, being at the maximum height allowance, that we did not create any sort of nuisance or noise on top of the structure.
Thanks, Dan. I think that's an important clarification. And honestly, I think there were probably times when we looked at that option. I mean, it's such an amazing street, but it was just not consistent with what the neighborhood would want. We want to respect that. So there are absolutely no plans or will not be a rooftop lounge or bar on the roof. So a follow-up to that, why we were questioned, this is great, was will you commit to never in the future requesting a rooftop deck? So would we be willing to commit to that?
Before this question, before you guys answer that question, I actually wanted to add to Dan's answer. The structure for the rooftop is not being designed to accommodate the live load of a roof deck. So even if somebody wants a rooftop deck in the future, they would basically have to reinforce the whole structure in order to do it. So I think we can safely commit to not having a rooftop deck up there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I second that.
Great. It sounds like we've got unanimity here then that we can absolutely commit to never in the future requesting a rooftop deck, not only because it can't happen structurally, but to the questioner, if there's some way we can verify that besides just here verbally, we certainly will commit to that. So whether that's in writing, or something we do on our submittal, we're happy to verify that we will not in now or in the future request a rooftop desk. Okay. So here's a follow-up question that kind of goes back to the heart of our site plan. So the question is pretty straightforward. So why not just build 3 stories with the 16-foot first floor? So it kind of goes to why not? We know we're staying within the same zoning envelope, right? So why not build it at 3 stories with the 16-foot first floor? Jim, I might turn that to you first and kind of go through that. Go ahead.
Sorry, I had my mute on. So I think, this comes to the core of the question, as you stated, Marcus. We have a hardship back here with trying to get that access off of the alley. And in an effort to take advantage of this site and contribute to Larimer in the best way we possibly can, we're requesting that 4th floor, that half of 4th floor, in order to add those the units on the Larimer side. So I guess I don't really know a better way to answer this other than we've got this hardship and this is how we're trying to alleviate it.
Yeah, and I want to say to the questioner, and I don't want it all be argumentative. I'm actually trying to have a discussion. So if you want to raise your hand, I'll be happy to call on you. But I think the other thing I would ask back, like respectfully, is the premise of the question says, so why not just build it at 3 stories with 16-foot first floor? Okay, so let's just establish if we did that, it would still have the exact same heights on Larimer. And the only difference is it would have a 16-foot first floor instead of 14 and a half, right? So that, just to be clear, all the earlier questions about the height and the actual height and all of that would stay the same, whether it's 3 or 4 stories. So I think the reverse of this is actually kind of why we're asking it. To make the building function is why we're doing the 4 stories. And we're designing it in a way to honor the remarkable work that the neighborhood did really to bring Larimer, to have that 16-foot, that datum line that seems so important to it, to really honor that. And we're actually going to work with the Arts Association, the neighborhood, to really be sure that we show that looks like a 16-foot floor there. So it really reflects that work that everybody worked on. So I think the end result, if you will, is the exact same thing. I think what we're trying to do is it actually makes the building function because of that alley being a full floor above us. We actually need that floor just to make the building work. That's kind of how that goes. So I think in some ways that's more of an internal building function. I don't think it really changes the shape or the envelope of the building itself other than seeing that additional floor. So I'd love your feelings on that if you agree with that. But I think that's kind of how we've approached it. It's really about making the building workable. So then the question comes back is, isn't this really an economic issue, a performa issue, as we look at kind of why are we building it this way instead of a 3-story and going to a 4-story? So Adam or Daniel or architects, anybody can fire away on that, or I'm happy to go to it as well. So if somebody wants to say, isn't this really an economic issue, feel free to provide an answer. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I can hop in on this one. It does come down to that in a little bit of a sense. And we try to be very thoughtfully designed here and want to provide the best building that we possibly can for the neighborhood. You know, we want to be really proud of what we're able to build here. And this allows us, I think, to do a lot more from a design perspective than if we were not allowed a half-story portion. You know, a lot of it too is when you look at it, we are required to do all of our loading activities off of the alley, which is on the 2nd floor, and have all of our services there, our transformers, our generators, all those things have to be on the 2nd level. That's eating into what normally would be units. So that's kind of where this hardship comes in is, you know, we go into the back side of the alley, and the back of the building is essentially unusable for us. And we have to move everything up a level in order to do that, eating into a lot of what would be rentable, which would be units typically. So it is a little bit of that. And also when we bring a retailer in here and we say, hey, you have to load from the 2nd floor, that could be that could be a major issue. You know, we're trying to work around that. And we're trying to not load from Larimer Street so we can keep the street presence there. So I'm not going to say, no, it's not all economic driven. There is a portion of it that is economics as well. And it's economics, but it's also functionality of how the building's ultimately going to function at the end of the day as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that's a very fair answer, Adam. And I think to our audience and community members, I mean, hardship criteria, there are economic conditions that are part of that as well. And there are things that we have to answer for the Board of Adjustment. So that very same question, a very fair question that you're asking, is asked by the board and will be when we go back to them. So just what Adam said, you're absolutely right. We can focus on, some of those impacts and why we have to design the building because of that topography. That's why we have to do it to really make this building possible. So let's see. I don't see, but I would encourage anybody else on the team. We have plenty of time here if people have additional questions. I don't see any more written questions that I haven't answered. Yes, I do. There's a new one that just came in. So here's the question, and I have to ask the rest of the team here to get a couple of answers. The question is, why did the developer not reach out to Rhino or Curtis Park or RNOs about this development? We, as neighbors, alerted both of these RNO to this development. And they go on to talk about, I had a meeting with Rhino recently as this past Friday, and it's my understanding they had still not been contacted by the developer. So I'm going to ask the rest of the team. One thing I will say is we certainly go through the statutory process, the neighborhood notice process, and all of that to talk with anybody. So we all know, we all live in Denver and work on these type of things, that the statutory requirement for a rezoning or a BOA to go through that process. So I think we worked honestly for a BOA process. I think we've had an incredibly robust community dialogue. And I'll just say this, we have purposely asked twice for a delay so that we can do additional discussions with the neighbors. So if we're missing someone or there's an RNO that you think we should have further discussion about, we are happy to engage with them. So I'm just going to provide that. We have your name, of course, who asked this question. I'm going to email you directly. So if you think there's somebody else we need to speak to, I am very happy to speak with them as well about this proposed BOA variance. We're going to go back, Jasper. I'm going to have you go to a site plan, or maybe Jim, you can direct us. But the next question, are are levels 2 through 4 all the same heights? I
think
can't see it in this current screen.
be the best one to go to.
Which one, bud?
Just go one more slide forward. Yeah. So yes, the quick answer is they are all the same height. So that top one at the 10 foot, 0, 1/8, there's some minor differences between the construction type between floors and roof. So that's why you see a little bit of a difference there. But from a facade standpoint, they are all the same.
Great. Thank you. That answers that one. I'm just rolling through here to see if there's anything else that I have missed. Are there anybody else on the team that thinks I have missed any of the questions here? Sorry, folks. This is that fun part of virtual meetings where we're all reading the screen. I may ask, I think we're doing, it's 5:50 or 5:45. We have plenty of time. So if somebody wants to ask a question themselves, if you want to raise your hand, I'm happy to call on you. Or if there are additional questions, I'm happy to have you just write them and we'll continue to go through it in more detail. I'm going to go to the participants and just see if anybody has any questions or wants to raise their hand. All right, folks, I'm not going to make you stay longer than you want. I will start and then we'll maybe go through this if anybody comes up with the last question. Maybe one just came more. So the question is, the 16-foot first floor is more flexible regarding future use. Please address. So I think that's probably Jim or, to our architects, that 16-foot first floor is more flexible regarding future use. Please address.
I think it's pretty indisputable that the more ceiling height you have, the more flexible a space is going to be. So I can't directly disagree with that. What I can say is that we do a lot of tenant improvement work in a lot of existing buildings throughout town. And a 16-foot ceiling height is generous. And we do work in significantly lower ceilings than that. So I think, again, while you're right, it is more flexible. I think the 1.5 feet off of that would still be flexible and desirable for future use.
And I'll comment on that as well. I think the 16 foot's really driven from an exterior standpoint, not really about, not necessarily the uses for the inside. Most retailers are happy with 14 feet clear. And I think that's one thing we really tried to address from an exterior standpoint is to make it, we haven't really changed it. You don't know if it's 16 feet, you don't know if it's 18 feet or 14 feet. It's very human, very human scale there. So it's really more about what is it inside the building than what you're going to see on the exterior of the building.
Good point.
Great. And I think that's probably also a lot of that where we're trying to honor that, right, on the exterior, that what the community worked so hard for on that 16 feet. So I think that's great. What I may do is here, because I don't see any other questions and nobody has raised their hand to be called on, I may just, if you don't mind, we have a very manageable group of attendees here. I just would like to ask, really, on behalf of the development team, we are trying to meet all of your requests. And so I would love if you have 2 seconds. Are we meeting your requests? Are we still missing something? I think we're within the zoning envelope. You understand, I believe, or we've certainly tried to articulate why we're doing 4 stories instead of 3. So if there are still some objections or concerns, if you would please let us know that would be really helpful for us, so for us to think about how to address those or maybe try to clarify that. So if anybody has 1 minute to write me a response, that would be great. I'll give us that minute, and then otherwise I'll probably wrap up the meeting here shortly. So I'll wait for that. Why we ask our attendees to do that. Jim or Dan or Adam, if there's anything that you would like to close with or share with the community, I'd open up the floor to you all right now if you'd like to share anything back with them.
I just want to thank everyone for taking the time and expressing your concerns and opening up to the group. I hope that we have answered all of your questions, and we're here to be an open forum, and this project is very meaningful to Adam and I, and we want to deliver something that the community is really going to appreciate. And, you know, by getting that additional half story, it does enable us to do something here that is architecturally significant and will create something that we think adds a lot of value to the neighborhood. So we appreciate your flexibility and willingness to work with us, and we hope we've answered all of your concerns.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Anybody else, or we're okay?
Yeah, I think, you know, as the architects on the project, Adam Steinbach and I, we want to make sure that it's clear that, you know, we're practicing architects living and working in Denver, and this is not something we'd be standing behind if we felt like it was a detriment to the neighborhood. We believe that this design is going to contribute to Larimer from both an aesthetic standpoint, an experiential standpoint, and an economic standpoint. So I don't want to be misrepresented here in trying to push something through that we don't feel is appropriate and sympathetic to everyone living there. So I quickly, you know, there was one question asked about why we didn't reach out to some of those people, and I do think that, you know, when we go through this again and in the future, we will need to be more direct in approaching those kind of things. But at the same time, I feel like there was a good amount of compromise that happened. And I think even along the way, you know, we were trying to consider what was going on in this neighborhood from both a personal level to a holistic level on the street. So.
Great. All right, folks, I think that is really well said from both of you, and I want to thank everybody as well. We really do appreciate the neighborhood. I hope we've proven that we're trying to really reflect what you want to see. I did answer 2 questions in writing at the bottom, and I provided my email, which is marcus@thepocknercompany.com, and then I provided my direct phone number here at the office. So if there is absolutely any question that remains or any concern that you have, if you would please just call me. So my phone number is 303-825-1671. That would be terrific if you all would feel free to call us. Any of our team members will sit down with you and go through that in any more detail. So again, 303-825-1671. We really do believe that we've addressed what we've heard from the community. We hope you feel that way as well. I can't thank you enough for taking an hour tonight on this busy time of year and certainly in this very challenging time. So thank you for doing it. We very much look forward. We will move forward with an application that reflects what's here to the BOA. We will be happy to email everyone that registered, and we'll send that date back to you. We would honestly, respectfully ask for your support for that BOA request. It's in accordance with what we've shown tonight, but we'll email that to everyone here. So with that, thank you very much for attending, and everybody have a great evening. Good night.